Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Okay, welcome to the William K. Stanford Town Library in Colonie, New York. I'd like to give a special welcome to C-SPAN, who's here filming. David Pietrusza is here again. He's written, his last book was 1960, LBJ versus JFK versus Nixon. His other book, recent book, was 1920, The Year of Six Presidents. His latest book he's going to tell us about is called Silent Cal's Almanack, The Homespun Wit and Wisdom of Vermont's Calvin Coolidge. So here's David Pietrusza to tell us about it.
Thank you, Joe. It's great to be back here at the Colonie Library. We had a great time last year. And I guess the basic question before us is, why chronicle and commemorate the words of the wordless Calvin Coolidge, a politician and president renowned for doing nothing and for saying less? Why indeed? Because the basic premise of the question is doubly flawed. The modern world views Silent Cal Coolidge as a failure, a political and personal cipher, a man who not only accomplished nothing, but who, as columnist and pundit Walter Lippmann once so famously charged, possessed a veritable genius for inactivity. It all depends, of course, how one defines inactivity. Presumably, Mr. Lippmann meant to damn Calvin Coolidge as an unimaginative, listless leader, and that's certainly bad. But if inactivity is defined as a spirited, principled, often brilliantly eloquent, active opposition to government intervention in the economy and the concurrent and resulting tax rates which result, that is profoundly good. And it is articulating and implementing that philosophy, that opposition. Calvin Coolidge was most decidedly a genius. He did not, of course, view himself as a genius or as a great man. It is, he observed, a great advantage to a president and a major source of safety to the country for him to know he is not a great man. But Calvin Coolidge did possess a remarkably coherent philosophy of government and of life itself. In fact, historian Paul Johnson has praised this supposed cipher as, quote, the most internally consistent and single-minded of modern American presidents. Calvin Coolidge may indeed have been the last Jeffersonian, a man who as president believed strongly enough in the limits of governmental power, and particularly of federal power, to resist the temptation to extend it, even when he himself would be the man implementing that power. Coolidge believed that the property of a nation belonged to the citizens of that nation and not to its government. He believed in strict obedience to the law, in service to others, in idealism rather than materialism. Quaint ideas nowadays, or maybe not so quaint. We have seen what believers in the all-powerful state have wrought. Some of the worst offenders were Coolidge's own contemporaries. While this supposedly simple Vermonter was carefully circumscribing his own powers, others around the world were not so reticent about government power. Even in his own day, many dismissed Coolidge's notions of limited government as hopelessly outdated and antiquated. He didn't care. He meant what he said, and he said what he thought, and remains among the most pithily eloquent advocates for properly restrained government and taxation, and concurrently for individual economic responsibility and liberty. He advocated a rigorously circumscribed federal government that empowered the American people to be free to be whatever they wanted to be. A simple philosophy. A philosophy so simple it took mankind until the late 18th century to figure it out. And it took the leadership of a Washington, an Adams, a Jefferson, a Madison, a Hamilton, a Franklin, and a pretty good supporting cast behind them to make it work. So simple that we seem to have forgotten it all. But as we glance back on what Mr. Coolidge articulated on such matters, we realize that not only could he clearly see what the founders had devised, he could discern the broader human condition. And he could see far ahead into the future, into a world where old verities, his verities, would quickly be discarded and disdained. Let's take one example, and a not particularly well-known one at that. In January 1914, on assuming control, or the office of the presidency of the Massachusetts State Senate, he told his fellow legislators, "The normal must care for themselves." The normal must care for themselves. What's he saying? He's saying that if you're a reasonable human, you should be able to clothe and feed and shelter yourself. You should be able to make decisions about your own property, about your future, about your children, about your own money, about choices and about options. Adults can take care of themselves. But note the subtext in that sentence. What about those who are not, quote unquote, normal? They need help. They cannot adequately fend for themselves. And others, here is the concept of service, once again, must assist them, preferably privately, or if that is not possible, only then through the auspices of the proper level of government. All that in 6 words. And he meant what he said. As Massachusetts Lieutenant Governor, he remarked regarding the state's mental institutions, "Our party will have no part in a scheme of economy which adds to the misery of the wards of the Commonwealth, the sick, the insane, and the unfortunate, those who are too weak even to protest. Because I know these conditions, I know a Republican administration would face an increasing state tax rather than not see them remedied." But Calvin Coolidge did not raise taxes, and he did not abandon or neglect the wards of the state. Just the opposite occurred. He lowered taxes again and again while providing needed services. He did this by practicing what he called economy, a stringent attack on government waste and a refusal to fund programs, no matter how politically popular, that he found to be mere raids on the public treasury or assaults on the federal Constitution. Yes, Calvin Coolidge was no soak-the-rich politician. The method of raising revenue, he said, ought not to impede the transaction of business. It ought to encourage it. I am opposed to extremely high rates because they produce little or no revenue, because they are bad for the country, and finally, because they are wrong. Again, he backed words with actions. American participation in the First World War had skyrocketed the highest marginal income tax rate from 7% to 77%. Coolidge's predecessor, Warren Harding, and Harding's Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, and this was also Coolidge's Secretary of the Treasury, slashed that to 56%, and Coolidge finished the job taking that marginal rate down to 20%. The results actually aided those of modest incomes. In 1920, the last year of Woodrow Wilson's administration, 15.4% of all personal income taxes were paid by those earning $5,000 a year or less. By the time Coolidge left office in 1929, that figure had shrunk to a minuscule 0.4%. Those earning $100,000 a year or more, the fat cats, had paid just 29.9% in 1920. By 1929, when Coolidge left office, the figure had climbed to 65.2%. Thus, when Coolidge leaves office, 98% of the American people pay no income tax at all. Quote, "It is only a tiny exaggeration," noted historian Thomas B. Silver, "to say that the Coolidge and Mellon completely removed the burden of federal income taxation from the backs of poor and working people." Calvin Coolidge cut federal income taxes 4 times. He produced a budget surplus each of the 6 years of his presidency. He could do all this because he not only understood economics and government, he understood human nature. In February 1924, he informed the National Republican Club, "If we had a tax whereby on the first working day, the government took 5% of your wages. On the second day, 10%. On the third day, 20%. On the fourth day, 30%. On the fifth day, 50%. And on the sixth day, people worked 6 days a week back then, 60%. How many of you would continue to work on the last 2 days of the week? It is the same with capital. Surplus income will go into tax-exempt securities. It will refuse to take the risk incidental in embarking in business. This will raise the rate which established business will have to pay for new capital and result in a marked increase in the cost of living. If new capital will not flow into competing enterprise, the present concerns tend toward monopoly, increasing again the prices which the people have to pay. He said more in that speech, so much more that a half-century later, economist Jude Winniski would label that address the most lucid articulation of the supply-side wedge model in modern times. H.L. Mencken once noted regarding Coolidge. He wrote simply, innocently, artlessly. He forgot all the literary affectations and set down his ideas exactly as they came into his head. The result was a bald but strangely appealing piece of writing, a composition of almost Lincolnesque austerity and beauty. The true Vermonter was in every line of it. Yet this master of articulation and plain speaking has fallen victim to one of the most egregious misunderstandings of the 20th century, derided as a slavish worshiper of commercial interests. The chief business of the American people is business, Coolidge said in January 1925. And for decades, these words have been hung around his neck by critics to label him as a hopeless Philistine, a worshiper of commercial and business interests. These words have been repeated ever since. But Coolidge did say the chief business of the American people is business. But he was only warming up to his main point, a message at considerable variance from what he has been charged with saying and meaning by ignorant, sloppy, naive, or just plain lazy writers ever since. Here is what Calvin Coolidge also said that day. So long as wealth is made the means and not the end, we need not greatly fear it. And there never was a time when wealth was so generally regarded as a means or so little regarded as an end as today. It is only those who do not understand our people, who believe that our national life is entirely absorbed by material motives. We make no concealment of the fact that we want wealth, but that there are many other things we want very much more. We want peace and honor and that charity which is so strong an element of all civilization. The chief ideal of the American people is idealism. I cannot repeat too often that America is a nation of idealists. Idealism. Again, no mere word to Calvin Coolidge. Indeed, regarding a man who chose his words so carefully, it is easy to believe there were no mere words. His entire adult life was spent in public service. Councilman, city solicitor, mayor, state representative, state senator, lieutenant governor, governor, vice president, president, more offices than any other president ever held. But it was not easy for him to be a public man, to speak, to meet persons, to shake hands, to do what ordinary politicians do as a matter of course. A horrible shyness possessed Calvin Coolidge, possessed him from his earliest days and never let go. He never denied it. He told friends. When I was a little fellow, I would go into a panic if I heard strange voices in the house. I felt I just couldn't meet people. Most of the visitors would sit with mother and father in the kitchen, and it was the hardest thing in the world to have to go through the kitchen door and give them a greeting. I was almost 10 before I realized I couldn't go on that way. And by fighting hard, I used to manage to get through that door. I'm all right with old friends, but every time I meet a stranger, I've got to go through the old kitchen door back home, and it's not easy. Yet, he achieved more public offices and won more elections than any other president. And in doing so, he accomplished what he wanted in the way he wanted to. He served without being servile, said the normally cynical Mr. H.L. Mencken regarding Mr. Coolidge. He begins to seem, in retrospect, an extremely comfortable and even praiseworthy citizen. His failings are forgotten. The country remembers only the grateful fact that he let it alone. Well, there are worse epithets for a statesman. If the day ever comes when Jefferson's warnings are heeded at last, and we reduce government to its simplest terms, it may very well happen that Cal's bones, now resting inconspicuously in the Vermont granite, will come to be revered as those of a man who really did the nation some service, as one might expect from a man born on the 4th of July. Yes, Calvin Coolidge was born on the 4th of July, July 4th, 1872 to be exact, in the minuscule central Vermont hamlet of Plymouth Notch, a collection of perhaps a dozen dwellings situated halfway between Ludlow and Bridgewater Corners. In other words, not particularly near anything save maple syrup and hillsides. He was not born rich nor poor, though by the standards of 1872 Plymouth Notch, his father, Colonel John Coolidge, was a man of means, a general storekeeper, insurance agent, farmer, and politician. Of his father, Calvin would write, "The lines he laid out were true and straight, and the curves regular. The work he did endured." And from his father's business, he learned this lesson, which never left him. As I went about with my father when he collected taxes, I knew that when taxes were laid, someone had to work to earn money to pay them. Of his mother, Victoria Josephine Moore Coolidge, he wrote, "Whatever was grand and beautiful in form and color attracted her. It seemed as though the rich green tints of the foliage and the blossoms of the flowers came for her in the springtime. And in the autumn, it was for her that the mountainsides were struck with crimson and gold." She died on her 39th birthday in March 1885. 5 Marches later, Calvin's younger sister, Abigail, died. She was 14. Their deaths moved Calvin Coolidge profoundly, forging a greater bond between surviving son and father, and no doubt reinforcing Coolidge's already powerful, almost crippling sense of shyness. He studied in a one-room stone schoolhouse, and later at Amherst, where his withdrawn Vermont ways proved both a puzzlement and an amusement to his more sophisticated and garrulous classmates. His habits then were the habits of his future life, none of them particularly pointing the way towards a political or any sort of public career. But he grew upon his classmates, as he invariably grew on just about everybody, becoming known as a humorous and accomplished, if somewhat laconic speaker. He graduated cum laude. He decided to practice law, not attending law school, instead clerking at law offices in Northampton, Massachusetts, just south of Amherst. On passing the bar, he set up a practice of his own, entered politics, and took a wife. Grace Goodhue was nothing like Calvin, save for also hailing from Vermont, Burlington to be exact, and by fate also drifting to Northampton. Outgoing and vivacious, educated at the University of Vermont, she taught at the local Clark School for the Deaf. One day, she happened to be walking past Coolidge's bachelor lodgings. She looked up, she saw him shaving while wearing a derby hat. She laughed, he heard her, he saw her, and resolved to meet her. They married in her parents' parlor in Burlington in October 4th, 1905. The couple eventually took a $27 a month lodging at 21 Massasoit Street, Northampton, half of a pleasant but modest white frame duplex. "I attended to the furnishing of it myself," he wrote, "and when it was ready, Mrs. Coolidge and I walked over to it. In about 2 weeks, our first boy came on the evening of September 7th. The fragrance of the clematis, which covered the bay window, filled the room like a benediction, where the mother lay with her baby. We called him John in honor of my father. It was all very wonderful to us. We liked the house where our children came to us and the neighbors who were so kind. When we could have had a more pretentious home, we still clung to it. So long as I lived there, I could be independent and serve the public without ever thinking that I could not maintain my position if I lost my office. All the while, Coolidge kept rising in politics. He won a term in the Massachusetts House. Traveling to Boston, he carried with him a letter of introduction. It read, "Like a singed cat, he is better than he looks." His political philosophy took shape, as did his lifelong predilection to acting without regard to electoral consequences. Said one Massachusetts labor leader regarding Coolidge, "In all my years of work in the legislature, I have never met a man in whose sense of justice and courage I had more trust." In 1918, he narrowly won the governorship and found himself confronted with two crises. The first involved a constitutional mandate to consolidate 118 government agencies into 20 within 3 years. It was a political minefield. Coolidge not only avoided tripping any mines, he did it within 1 year and won accolades and friends. The second and greater crisis involved the Boston police force. When in September 1919, Boston Police Commissioner Edwin U. Curtis disciplined union leaders, 1,500 cops walked off the job, leaving the city unprotected. Violence and lawlessness erupted. Boston Mayor Andrew J. Peters illegally removed Curtis from office. Coolidge reinstated Curtis. He called out the full state guard. He broke the strike. When the American Federation of Labor leader Samuel Gompers demanded that Coolidge reinstate the striking police force to the jobs they had abandoned, Coolidge responded, "There is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime." Coolidge's advisors thought his actions would alienate labor support and cost him re-election. He thought so too, and he didn't care. "It does not matter," he said, "whether I am elected or not." But instead, Coolidge's response caught the imagination of the American people, electrified the nation, stamping him as a no-nonsense champion of post-war law and order. He swamped his Democratic opponent that November, winning 62% of the vote. And the victory fueled a Coolidge for President boomlet. He resisted that. He really didn't go out and campaign, but his name was placed in nomination at the 1920 Republican National Convention, and he might have gathered more votes had he had the support of his own United States Senator, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge. "Nominate a man who lives in a two-family house," said Lodge. "Never." Ohio's dark horse candidate, Ohio Senator Warren Gamaliel Harding, won the nomination on the 10th ballot. And when time came to nominate a vice presidential candidate, the delegates rebelled. They refused to nominate the convention's choice, the power structure's choice, a guy named Irvine Lenroot, who was from Wisconsin. Instead, they stampeded and they nominated Calvin Coolidge. "Harding will never serve his term out," they said in the press box. "He'll die and Coolidge will be president." Coolidge luck. That November, Harding and Coolidge swamped the Democratic standard bearers. They got 60% of the vote. 60% of the vote against James Middleton Cox and his vice presidential candidate, a guy you may have heard of named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. That November, or rather, when they took office, when Coolidge took office, he chafed under the idleness, the lack of responsibility in the vice presidency. His only actual duty by the Constitution was to preside over the United States Senate, and this really doesn't take much effort. So he wrote, "I soon found that the Senate had but one fixed rule, subject to exceptions, of course, which was to the effect that the Senate would do anything it wanted to do whenever it wanted to do it. When I had learned that, I did not waste much time with the other rules, because they were so seldom applied." So unable to prove himself through accomplishment, Washington saw him only as a silent little red-headed man who Warren Harding would probably dump from the ticket in 1924. But the Coolidge luck eventually did strike, and when it struck in spades. When Warren Harding died in August 1923, Calvin Coolidge was vacationing in Plymouth Notch, and by flickering kerosene light at 1 o'clock in the morning, he was sworn in as President of the United States of America by his 78-year-old notary public father. When the modest ceremony was complete, the new president walked down the darkened road to visit his mother's grave. And he came back and he said, "I think I could swing it." He did swing it. Many, again, underestimated him. They thought he wouldn't be nominated for president because no accidental president, save for Teddy Roosevelt, ever had one renomination in his own right. But as President, Coolidge cleaned up the whole residue of the scandals of the Harding administration in the Interior Department, in the Veterans Affairs Bureau, in the Justice Department, the whole Teapot Dome mess. He restored faith in government, in public honesty, easily won renomination, and that November, he's elected in a three-way race. He carries every state but one outside the Democratic Solid South. He carries every county in New England, and he is the last Republican president to ever carry New York City. Coolidge's often maligned administration provided a wide variety of constructive measures and witnessed unprecedented economic growth, the Coolidge prosperity. His fiscal policies boasted still unequaled accomplishment, triggering a widely based economic boom. Unemployment averaged 3.3%. The gross national product increased annually by 7%. Per capita income grew 30%. Real earnings for employed wage earners increased 22%. Industrial production shot up 70%. The average work week decreased 4%. Consumer prices rose just 0.4%. No inflation at all. National wealth rose 17.5%. Total education spending rose fourfold. And in the decade itself, automobile ownership rose threefold, illiteracy fell by half. Historian Paul Johnson summed it up. Quote, "Under Harding and still more under Coolidge, the USA enjoyed a general prosperity that was historically unique in its experience or of that of any other society," unquote. Coolidge was the last president to write all his own speeches, and he delivered more of them than any of his predecessors. As president, he held 520 news conferences, 8 per month. His formal inauguration address was, for some reason, expected to set a record for brevity. But his 4,005 words edged Warren Harding's 3,318 and the 3,328 of Woodrow Wilson's 2 inaugurations. It is not entirely ironic that a collection of Coolidge press conference transcripts is entitled "The Talkative President." Over the course of a 3-decade-long political career, he provided his opinion on any number of topics. He never wasted words, never minced words. And here's a sample of what Simon Cowell had to say. Regarding his most basic philosophy of government, he contended, "I favor the policy of economy not because I wish to save money, but because I wish to save people. The men and women of this country who toil are the ones who bear the cost of the government. Every dollar that we carelessly waste means that their life will be so much more the meager. Every dollar that we prudently save means that their life will be so much more the abundant. Economy is idealism in its most practical form. Or putting it more bluntly, I am for economy. After that, I am for more economy. Regarding taxes, he said, collecting more taxes than is absolutely necessary is legalized robbery. And high taxes make high prices. Regarding service, no person was ever honored for what he received. Honor has been the reward for what he gave. On congressional pork, the people who start to elect a man to get what he can for his district will probably find they have elected a man who will get what he can for himself. And on morality, a nation that is morally dead will soon be financially dead. And further, if we are too weak to take charge of our own morality, we shall not be strong enough to take charge of our own liberty. On politics, the political mind is the product of men in public life who have been twice spoiled. They have been spoiled with praise, and they have been spoiled with abuse. And there is only one form of political strategy in which I have any confidence, and that is to try to do the right thing and sometimes to succeed. On self-government, it is very difficult to reconcile the American ideal of a sovereign people capable of owning and managing their own government with an inability to own and manage their own business. On price controls, it is not possible to repeal the law of supply and demand, of cause and effect, or of action and reaction. Value is a matter of opinion. An act of Congress has small jurisdiction over what men think. On the principles of the Founding Fathers, these principles have now the same binding force as in those revolutionary days when they were recognized and proclaimed. I am not unaware that they are old. Whatever is old. What is new is our own misunderstanding of it. On our national needs, we do not need more material development. We need more spiritual development. We do not need more intellectual power. We need more moral power. We do not need more knowledge. We need more character. We do not need more government. We need more culture. We do not need more laws. We need more religion. We do not need more of the things that are seen. We need more of the things that are unseen. On wages, those who do only what they are paid for will never be paid very much. On criticism, destructive criticism is always easy because despite some campaign oratory, some of us are not yet perfect. And if we judge ourselves only by our aspirations and everyone else only by their conduct, we shall soon reach a very false conclusion. When we have exhausted the possibilities of criticism on ourselves, it will be time enough to apply it to others. On the art of legislating, it is much more important to kill bad bills than to pass good ones. On tough economic times, when depression in business comes, we begin to be very conservative in our financial affairs. We save our money and take no chances in its investment. Yet in our political actions, we go in the opposite direction. We begin to support radical measures and cast our votes for those who advance the most reckless proposals. This is a curious and illogical reaction. When times are good, we might take a chance on radical government. But when we are financially weakened, we need the soundest and wisest of men and measures. On soaking the rich, we cannot finance the country. We cannot improve social conditions through any system of injustice, even if we attempt to inflict it upon the rich. Those who suffer the harm will be the poor. This country believes in prosperity. It is absurd to suppose that it is envious of those who are already prosperous. The wise and correct course to follow in taxation and other economic legislation is not to destroy those who have already secured success, but to create conditions under which everyone will have a chance to be successful. The verdict of the country has been given on this question. That verdict stands. On fair trade or free trade or protectionism or whatever one might choose to call it, we wish to protect our own wage earners, our agriculture and industry, from the results of dumping produce on our markets at a price with which they could not compete. But the policy has a deeper significance than that. We are unwilling to profit by the distress of foreign people. We do not want their blood money. Our efforts are not only to protect our own people from cheap goods, which President McKinley said meant cheap men, but we propose to set up a standard that will discourage other nations from exploiting their people by producing cheap goods. Our policy requires fair wages for both domestic and foreign production. We have no market for blood and tears. And my observation of protectionism is that it has been successful in practice, however unsound it may appear to be in theory. That must mean the theories have not taken account of all the facts. And having once toiled in the regulatory reform field, I always found this quote to be of particular interest. The attempt to regulate, control, and prescribe all manner of conduct and social relations is very old. It was always the practice of primitive people. And somewhat less bluntly, we have had many attempts at regulation of industrial activity by law. Some of it has proceeded on the theory that if those who enjoyed material prosperity used it for the wrong purposes, such prosperity should be limited or abolished. That is as sound as it would be to abolish writing to prevent forgery. And you've probably heard this bit of advice before, maybe not known who it came from. Nothing in this world can take the place of persistence. Talent will not. Nothing is more common than unsuccessful people with talent. Genius will not. Unrewarded genius is almost a proverb. Education will not. The world is full of educated derelicts. Persistence and a determination alone are omnipotent. The slogan, "Press on," has solved and always will solve the problems of the human race. The Coolidge years were a time of accomplishment, of prosperity, indeed, of domestic tranquility. Yet Coolidge could not enjoy his presidency. The Coolidge luck ran out in June 1924, when his younger son, 16-year-old Calvin Jr., playing tennis on the White House courts, developed a blister on his right foot. Infection and pathogenic blood poisoning resulted. From the very beginning, the infection was serious, and from the very beginning, Coolidge seemed to know it. In an age without antibiotics, Calvin Jr. died that July 7. In his suffering, he asked me to make him well, the president wrote. I could not. When he went, the power and glory of the presidency went with him. The ways of providence are often beyond our understanding. It seemed to me that the world had need of the work that it was capable he could do. I do not know why such a price was exacted for occupying the White House. To escape Washington's summer doldrums, the Coolidges usually fled to cooler climes, to Plymouth Notch, to Swampscott, Massachusetts, to the Adirondacks, to Superior, Wisconsin. In 1927, they summered in the Black Hills at Rapid City, South Dakota. And on Tuesday, August 2, 1927, exactly 4 years to the day after Calvin Coolidge became president, he stood in a classroom in Rapid City, South Dakota, and handed out tiny slips of paper to amazed newsmen. Each read, "I do not choose to run for president," in 1928. The political world thought he was angling for a draft. He wasn't. In March 1929, Calvin Coolidge retired to Northampton. He reluctantly handed over the country to his former Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover. But he wasn't crazy about Herbert Hoover. Said Coolidge, "That man has given me nothing but advice, and all of it bad." In retirement, Coolidge dabbled at law. He earned $3,000 a week authoring a popular syndicated newspaper column, and he composed his tersely eloquent and even poetic autobiography, the autobiography of Calvin Coolidge. His world was now a different world. He had moved back to Massasoit Street only to discover that the next president cannot live in a two-family house upon an ordinary small-town street. Autos crowded with curiosity seekers rolled by in constant procession. Admirers trampled his lawn. They trespassed upon his tiny porch. They peered through his windows. He and Grace paid $40,000 to move to larger quarters, the beaches, 16 rooms on 9 acres overlooking the Connecticut River, a house far grander than Massasoit Street, far less grand than Pennsylvania Avenue. It was there that he died on Thursday, January 5, 1933. Disturbed by the Great Depression, still saddened by his young son's passing, and possessing fewer and fewer reserves of energy, he returned home from his offices at noon. As he shaved, a heart attack felled him. They buried Calvin Coolidge at Plymouth Notch in the family graveyard, next to his mother and father and sister and son, in the most humble grave of any American president. No signs directed visitors. No gate surrounds it. No words indicated the many offices he had held. No words. That is the way Calvin Coolidge would have wanted it. Thank you very much.
Wait for the microphone over here.
Painted a wonderful picture of Calvin Coolidge.
Madam, can you wait for the microphone? Where your words will be reaching the nation, a grateful nation.
However,
Yes.
when I read about his refusal to recognize the United Nations after World War I, and we never entered it during his administration, it made me feel that he was localized in his point of view. It didn't extend beyond our borders. And also he did subsidize farmers, and he had a high tariff, I think, during his administration. And I just wondered if that was some kind of weakness. And the very fact that he had Herbert Hoover for his, the head of the Department of Commerce, and within just 4 years after he resigned as president, this terrible depression descended upon us. So I don't want to point to him as someone who was limited because you did so well I couldn't compete at any price. But I do feel there was something in his point of view that was a weakness. And it was a worldview that distressed me when I read about it. Can you comment?
Sure. You've covered a lot of ground, and I thank you that because you've raised some things which I did not cover when I spoke. He did not favor the League of Nations because I think American public opinion, which was sort of mixed on the topic originally, had really moved on from that point. And even when you see Franklin Roosevelt coming in 1933 with a solid Democratic Congress, House and Senate, you see the America never moves into the League of Nations. It wasn't just Harding and Coolidge and Hoover, but it was also Roosevelt who never went into that, even though he eventually came up with his sort of League of Nations 2.0, the United Nations in 1945. Coolidge did favor U.S. participation in the World Court. He avoided threat of war. There was a possibility of war with Mexico. There was very bad feelings with that country at that point. He avoided that and restored good relations with that. He withdrew U.S. Troops from Nicaragua and was the first president to personally attend the Conference of Inter-American States in Havana. Beyond that, there was a 5-power naval treaty. Very important, the Dawes Plan. Dawes became his vice president for German reparations. And there was the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which was to outlaw war as an instrument of international foreign policy. So you see a lot of things going on there. He actually vetoed the McNary-Haugen Act, which was for farm aid, and I think he did that twice. That was fairly controversial at the time, but he was in fact quite consistent on that point. So I think those were your 2 main points. As to Herbert Hoover, I think he would agree with your assessment. Any other questions? In the back?
Do you think he was prescient enough to know what was coming? Do you think that by failing to run in November of 28 and leaving office in March of 29, and in October of 29 the wheels come off the wagon, did he know what was coming?
I don't know. I mean, some people do say that he did know, and that there's quotes, and they're kind of unverified. There was a quote of Grace Coolidge where she said, "Papa says there's a depression coming, and it's like time to scram." And you know, the business cycle had been very cyclical. So in the 1890s, you've got a Grover Cleveland major depression, and you've got a panic in 1907 under Teddy Roosevelt, and the big Coolidge or Woodrow Wilson depression of 1920, 1921. So these things came about every 10 years, and the question was how you dealt with them. I think that not only there's been a lot of questions as to how bummed out he was, and he was seriously depressed over the death of his son, which is of course quite rational. But this took the steam and the glory out of the presidency for him, and more so, almost more so. In 1926, his father died, and he may have been closer to his father than anyone else. So he has these 2 personal tragedies clouding his presidency. He's not feeling well. In 1932, they want him to speak for Herbert Hoover, and he's really begging off. He's really begging off, and you know, aside from his personal feelings, he doesn't want to do it. He says his throat hurts, everything. He doesn't, you know. And as a matter of fact, he's dead. He's dead before Franklin Roosevelt takes office. He had that heart problem, and I think he probably simply thought he had accomplished. He'd gone all the way. What more was there to do? And as he said, American presidents return to the people, and it is good for me to return to them. So I think he had said that he was not a great man. It was not essential for him to hold public office, although someone once asked him, "Do you have any hobbies?" And he said, "Yeah, holding elective office." But it didn't mean that much to him where it was an absolute compulsion. And if the people didn't feel a need for him to stay on, he wouldn't stay on. You have another question?
I was just going to say, if I can do the math, he was 51 when he died?
I think it was 62.
Well, I'm sorry, I can't do the math.
Yeah, it's a very disconcerting age to me right about now. In the front?
First of all, this is a terrific book. I keep it by my nightstand. It's so pithy on every page. I always find something from it, so congratulations on that. Now, I realize that you're an historian, not a prophet. I heard that on C-SPAN the last time you were here. There are certain aspects of Coolidge's political philosophy that seem to be rising nationally for probably the first time since he left the presidency. I hear a lot of Coolidge in what I hear in the Tea Party movement. Do you think that it's possible that Coolidge political philosophy is not just something antiquated, but something that we might see again implemented?
Well, I'm a historian, not a prophet. But I mean, yeah, things go in cycles. And Reagan was sort of like the second, even though Reagan had been a big fan of FDR, he was, by the time he was president, he'd become more conservative and became a big Coolidge fan and replaced a portrait of Harry Truman that that hung in the White House with one of Calvin Coolidge, which surprised a hell of a lot of people. And this very year, we've heard Glenn Beck kind of resurrecting Coolidge's philosophy and persona on his TV show, and that's CPAC. So I think that the timing might be right for a Coolidge boomlet. People are looking at this, and as I quoted him quoting the Founding Fathers, we see a lot of similarities in that philosophy, and we are seeing so much more of an interest in the Founding Fathers, where this might carry over. And we have in Coolidge a distillation of that philosophy, which is so pure. And in implementing it, so effective. One of the ways I was going to start this speech, and then I said, no, I'll do what I did, but was, politicians stand up in front of you every time they want to be elected, and they say, well, I'm going to cut spending, and I'm going to balance the budget, and I'm going to reduce the debt, and I'm going to cut out all the waste in government. And they never do it. They never do it. We fall for it all the time. They never do it. Calvin Coolidge did it, and then we say, he didn't accomplish anything. He spent 6 years in, he never accomplished a damn thing, and he did everything that every politician ever promises to do. So that is not too bad an act to follow.
Promise those things?
Yes, I don't know if he promised them outright. He probably said he would try his best, because promising might be overstating for him. But he would probably work at all, which actually, I was an alderman once, and I refused to promise I wouldn't raise taxes, even though I damn well didn't raise taxes, I'll tell you that. But it can be rash, because you don't know what circumstances will dictate, but you can know what your principles also guide you in. Yes, sir.
What do you think Cal's attitude would be to the way we're handling our financial situation today in this country?
Well, I haven't consulted him on that, but I think he would be quite aghast at this level of deficits. This would particularly in peacetime. I mean, it's one thing to run, and I guess you could say, well, there's been Iraq and there's been Afghanistan, but those are sort of back boiler kind of conflicts, not in the same circumstances as a world war. But nonetheless, this level of deficit spending gives pause to everyone. And you see right now where voices within the administration are suddenly worried about it, but that their response is not to say, gee, maybe we spent too much in the last year, but gee, maybe we need another tax, and one hell of a big tax with a value-added tax, which is Canada has a national sales tax. And I cannot believe that Coolidge would countenance any of that. Any further questions?
If not,
Oh, one more?
Well, yeah, as long as you're going to pause. A blogger friend of mine named Meep says that her favorite Coolidge anecdote is the one about he and Grace visiting the chicken farm.
Not the chicken farm one.
I know you've looked into this. It's a great story.
Yes.
What have you learned about it?
That's probably not true. Why don't you tell it?
You want me to tell the
You
story?
tell the story.
All right. Grace and Calvin go to this chicken farm while he's president. They go on separate tours. And Grace is hearing all about this fantastic rooster who makes love to the other chickens like 20, 40 times a day. And she says, be sure to tell that to Mr. Coolidge when he comes around. And so Coolidge comes around, and they say what Grace said. He said, Same hen? No, different hens. Tell that to Mrs. Coolidge.
Anyway, on that note, regarding Coolidge's speech in favor of Hoover at Madison Square Garden, a lady came up to him afterwards and said, "You know, Mr. Coolidge, I enjoyed your talk so much that I stood the entire time." And he said, "So did I." And I've enjoyed this too. So thank you all for coming.